Okay, I'll get us started. Welcome to this final session of the Global Middle East Seminar Series. My name is Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. The Global Middle East Seminar is a co-production, result of a partnership between the History and Public Policy Program and the Russian Studies Center at Bilkent University, represented here today by Eliza Georgi, but certainly part of the partnership are honor professors Honor Ishii and Sam Hurst, who are watching us from various locations. Professor Georgi will conclude our discussions today. So let me turn right to the substance of our event. We will discuss today, which I'm very excited about, the initial results of an oral history and documentation project of the Arms Control and Regional Security Process, ACRS, which we, the Wilson Center and the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, conducted with support from the Carnegie Corporation over the past 2 years. Last month, we held a final critical oral history conference with former participants of the ACRS process, and we will share some of the findings of this 2-year project today. The driving forces, in many ways, behind this project have been our two partners at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, Dr. Hanna Notte and Dr. Kane. I will introduce both of them, and also our commentator and facilitator today, our discussant, Professor Patricia Lewis. Let me introduce Hanna and Chen and Professor Lewis, and then I'll turn it over to Hanna for some introductory remarks before Patricia will, I think, facilitate an initial conversation, a conversation that we hope you in the audience will also join later in the session. You can do so in 2 ways. You can cue yourself by using the raise hand function. You'll be put into a queue. Once we get to the discussion, to the Q&A period, we'll call on you to unmute yourself. Please do, and at that point, you will be able to pose your question to the panelists. You can also use the Q&A functionality in Zoom. In my case, it's at the top of the screen, but it may be at the bottom of your screen, depending on your computer. You can post your question there in writing, and either Patricia or I will pose the question to our panelists. Let me then introduce our panelists, and first our 2 dear partners, Hanna and Chen. Dr. Hanna Notte is a senior research associate with the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation in Austria. She was formerly a senior non-resident scholar at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute and a senior political officer with the Scheik Group. She has also completed visiting research stints all over the Middle East and Europe, including Russia, Lebanon, and Bahrain. Her research focuses on arms control and security issues involving Russia, the Middle East, their intersection and implications for US and European policy. She has published her findings and analysis in periodicals such as the Non-Proliferation Review, Foreign Policy, The National Interest, and Carnegie, among others, and has guest lectured at institutions such as the Middlebury Institute, the American University of Paris, and the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. We at the Wilson Center have been very fortunate to work with Hanna for a couple of years now, as mentioned, on the ACRS Oral History Project, and I've really appreciated her thorough, well-reasoned, very careful, but brilliant in many ways approach to the project and the work, especially as she has taken the lead on the project in recent months and facing myriad complications brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. So Hanna, wonderful to have you with us here. Kane, Dr. Kane is the director of the Middle East Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies of the Middlebury Institute, our institutional partner in this project. She is also the founder of the Middle East Next Generation Arms Control Network and serves as a project lead of the Middle East Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone Project at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. That was a mouthful, wow. She has held research positions at the Balfour Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, as well as the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She has also served as an advisor to both the Jepsen Center for Counterterrorism at Tufts University, as well as an adjunct professor with the National Defense University. Prior to joining CNS, she worked at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Kane's work focuses on projects related to reducing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism, with particular focus on the Middle East. In addition, she examines the means to strengthen the International Atomic Energy's safeguard system and the projected expansion of nuclear energy in the Middle East. The ACRS Oral History Project that we will be discussing today is in large measure a brainchild of Dr. Kane, and we're incredibly grateful to her for her tremendous work, for her leadership. She and the team at CNS have put into the project to make it a reality, and we could not have wished for better partners than Hanna and Chen. So thank you both, and welcome to this Global Middle East Seminar session. Now, Patricia Lewis is not yet with us. Let me introduce her. Our hope is she will join us momentarily, otherwise we'll improvise until she enters the Zoom room. Dr. Patricia Lewis is the Director of International Security Program at Chatham House. Dr. Lewis previously served as Deputy Director and Scientist in Residence at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies of the former Monterey Institute of International Studies, as Director of the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, and as Director of Verification, Research, Training, and Information Center in London. Dr. Lewis was a member of Hans Blix's 2004-2006 WMD Commission, the 2010-2011 Advisory Panel on the Future Priorities of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and was an advisor to the 2008-2010 International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. Adding to her many accomplishments, in 2009, she received the American Physical Society's Joseph A. Burton Forum Award for outstanding contributions to the public understanding or resolution of issues involving the interface of physics and society. We feel very fortunate that hopefully we'll have Dr. Lewis here today to help stimulate the discussion of the ACRS Oral History Project and to provide her own invaluable perspective on the subject under discussion today. With that, let me turn it over to Dr. Hanna Notte for an initial introduction to the project. Before then, we will enter into the discussion with both Hanna and Dr. Kane. Hanna.
Thank you so much, Christian, and we can return the compliments. We have been extremely happy about this partnership with the Wilson Center in this oral history project over the last 18 months or so. Before my colleague Chen and I go into a structured discussion to share with you some of the findings from our oral history project, really on the inception of ACRS, its format, its achievements, its problems, its ultimate demise, and also lessons learned, I wanted to talk briefly about what this project actually entails so that the audience understands from which basis we're sharing our findings today. So this project was conceived in 2013 when it appeared that there were prospects for a regional arms control and security dialogue and for negotiations. And at that point, it seemed almost reckless that there was no full comprehensive account of the only other prior process, the ACRS process in the 1990s, that could inform such negotiations. We know that no official records were taken during the ACRS talks. And while much has been written, certainly, about the ACRS talks, including by people who participated in the working group, there was really no comprehensive account based on the recollections of all the parties that participated. And it's really these gaps in the historical record that spurred our interest in conducting this oral history. So what we really did over the last 18 months or so is we conducted oral history interviews, really extensive conversations with around 40 former delegates in the ACRS talks from key parties, including Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Palestine, the United States, of course, but also from Canada, the Netherlands, India, Turkey, so countries, third parties that supported the process. And we further augmented those oral history interviews with hundreds of documents which were collected by Mike Yaffe, who was part of the US delegation to ACRS, in order to really build a comprehensive picture of the process. And we're very grateful for Mike Yaffe's support to this project. We also hope to get additional documents, relevant documents that speak to the ACRS process from the US presidential libraries. We are encountering some delays here due to the pandemic, but we hope that we will get those documents and everything will be compiled in a comprehensive digital archive on ACRS that will be hosted by the Wilson Center. So this is what this project has entailed. So really today we're speaking to you on the basis of having conducted many, many conversations with the people who negotiated in this process and are delighted to share some of the findings from that research and discuss them with the audience. I'll hand it back to Christian for the moment.
Sure. We're going to improvise a little as we're waiting for Patricia to join, which we hope she will do momentarily.
I'm also happy to kind of kick off with the discussion, and then Patricia can take over from me when she joins. But Chen, let me ask you, can you talk a little bit about the inception of ACRS, how it came about, what were some of the both international and regional developments, the atmospherics at the time that facilitated for this process to take off? And can you talk a little bit about sort of Madrid and how we got from the Madrid Peace Conference to ACRS?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Christian and Liz, for hosting us, and the Carnegie Endowment for supporting the project, and Hanna for leading the project. And I will just want to also mention, as we can see from the participant list, some of them that join us is actually our ACRS negotiators, so that we interviewed. So we are very excited to have them obviously here. And I wanted also to acknowledge and thank them, as well as welcome their remarks in the Q&A. I also want to note that as opposed to what usually CNS is used to with regard to policy papers, this was really a new adventure for us as the oral history one. And all the insights that either I and Hanna are going to speak about right now are based on our interviews. So with that, let me answer the question about, hello, Patricia. Let me answer the question about the inception of ACRS. So really, there is agreement among all the people that we interviewed that the convergence of events at the international as well as regional level created opportune moment in history that allowed for the establishment of the Arms Control and Regional Security Working Group. As one interviewee coined, it was on a global basis a turning point. And in the international and regional conditions, really, in addition to on the international level, the US just demonstrated practically during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, that its capacity to mobilize the world and to carry out a military operation that ended the war within 100 hours. In addition, the collapse of the Soviet Union really opened up new opportunities for the US as it found itself as the only superpower. And as one American interview put it, Russia at the time was not really a competitor or sort of any negative voice. And as such, the 1990s were really, and as another American interview coined, in many ways, the golden age of arms control in terms of the amount and variety of arms control agreements that were secured during the Bush first administration. The US felt that it could support and initiate arms control and the non-proliferation measures both on the bilateral and multilateral levels. So bilaterally, as you might remember, it just was a few years after US and Soviet Union issued the 1985 Reagan-Gorbachev statement that a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. They also concluded the 1987 INF Treaty along the 1991 conclusion of START. So it really was a renaissance of arms control on the bilateral level, but also there were positive international non-proliferation development as US concluded with DPRK, the agreed framework in 1994. So it was along the time that ACRS was negotiating. South Africa gave up its nuclear weapons and the Chemical Weapon Convention was concluded in 1993, and there was a significant progress on the Comprehensive Testament Treaty, the CTBT negotiation at that time. So that is sort of the setting that on the international level. On the regional level, the collapse of the Soviet Union also had geostrategic impact. So on one end, according to an Egyptian interviewee, it allowed progress and new initiatives since there was no paralysis. There was no one side vetoing one another on every issue. So in fact, really the superpower were in unison and they managed to work together and the Cold War debate was no longer in the Middle East. So that was a significant point. Another one, the collapse of the Soviet Union was also significant from the balance of power aspects. The Arab practically lost their protege and arms supplier on one end. And for the Israel, the standpoint, it removed from the regional power balance of power the protege of its rivals. The defeat of Iraq during the Gulf War was also significant because it changed the balance of power in the region in several ways. In one end, it eliminated for Israel a significant threat, allowing it to take more risks, but it also fragmented further the Arab world. It was the first time that an Arab countries join a coalition against another Arab country, against Saddam Hussein. And since both Arafat and Jordan supported Iraq, they lost their support from the Saudis and others in the region for money and funding, and they really needed the US for financial aid and political support. So you will see a lot of movements at the time on the regional level. I will say also that most specifically in regard to non-proliferation, arms control issues, specifically the discovery of the Iraq weapon of mass destruction programs, as well as coupled with Saddam Hussein threat to use chemical weapons, really highlighted the regional proliferation security concerns. And according to an Egyptian interviewee, the prospect for the actual use of weapon of mass destruction in a regional armed conflict was really the impetus of Egypt's proactive position on the issue of weapon of mass destruction on a regional level. With that, really, yes, Patricia.
So thanks, Hanna. I wanted to first of all apologize to everyone. I was sitting on another call where I was told obviously it was another call, but I was told I was going to be let in. So I was just waiting for it to start. I don't know what happened. So my apologies. And I wanted to just quiz you a little bit on the context, which is such a great beginning, but it's, with Iraq in 91, we also had the use of chemical weapons, of course, in the Iraq-Iran war. And the issue of Iran nowadays, of course, is such a major issue, particularly for Israel, but also for all of the countries in the region. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about the way in which Iran was thought of at the time, and the reasons why Iran was not really part of this process, and give us some of that context. It would be really helpful.
Of course. So you're completely right that the rivalry between Iraq and Iran in the region created processes that we were not aware of at that time. So practically the use of chemical weapons by Iraq against Iran at that time was really devastating experience for Iran. Iran started their both chemical as well as nuclear, or restarted a nuclear weapons program because of that. And the fact especially that the world was not only quiet, but actively supporting Saddam Hussein at that time was also created isolation feeling as well as really almost siege mentality within Iran. So this happened at the same time, but really on the global level, or sorry, in the regional level, Iran was not considered a threat. Iran was not considered a major player. And at the time, the main one was Iraq, and their elimination sort of as a threat will really open opportunities. But it also caused to an interesting situation where both Iraq and Iran and also Libya were not invited to ACRS. And taking us sort of to the world in 1990s, the world was really, the region was looked at in the US side really post-Gulf War, and they invited to the Madrid process the winners. And you can see some of the lesson on, I don't know if lesson learned, but some of commonality that what happened post-World War II. Both Iraq as well as Iran and Libya were not invited to participate in Madrid process, which was a peace process, mainly because they didn't support it. And they were considered outsiders, but also they consider weak players that don't need to be taken into account. I must say though that within that decision of not to invite them, and that was agreed across the board. So when we interviewed both other countries from the region, Egyptian, Israelis, there was agreement that to invite them will be a bridge too far to be able to actually get them into the room, either by agreement or because they were a pariah. They were under international sanctions, they were considered a pariah, and they were not invited, they were not wanted to be included by regional states. So in many ways, the fact that they were not invited, and Hanna will speak about it, about the constraint of the fact that they were not invited and the consequences, was really though agreed by all regional states at that time, and the US and Russia, that that is the right way to go. And also I must say that the idea was that if there is progress, or if there will be a progress, they will have to be engaged one way or the other. So the idea was not to exclude them forever, but at the time where the process just started, they were considered really not something that was able to, as a group of countries that were not really able to be included in the process. Just to note that the three of them were not invited, but then two countries decided not to join, and this is Syria and Lebanon. Syria and Lebanon were invited, but both of them decided not to join the multilateral process. So if we take it to the history, practically Madrid initiated two parallel processes, a bilateral one between Israel and the Jordanian, Israel and the Palestinian, and Israel and the Syrians, but also multilateral, which is 5 different working groups that ACRS was one of them. At that time, both Syria and Lebanon, that was really almost part of Syria at the time, decided not to join the multilaterals until the bilaterals issues are being resolved between them and Israel.
So I'm just going to put you on notice, Hen, that when I come back at the end, I'm going to go back to this in terms of lessons learned. Okay, so get ready. Hanna, you wanted to come in and maybe talk a bit about the whole where you see that whole process taking us as it went on.
Oh, I mean, I was just going to come in on the question of participation, just to make a very quick addition to what Chen said. It's very much true that there was a sort of uniform feeling among the people that we interviewed that perhaps including Iran, Iraq, and Libya at the time was a bridge too far. At the same time, I think you know, American diplomats who were very involved in this process, they realized from the outset that this was going to be problematic at the end of the day, not to have some of these major players in the room. I also had a Turkish diplomat say to me in one of the interviews, you know, we told the Americans at the beginning that this is an important mission and it will sort of, you know, cause difficulties over time. Also someone saying, you know, you cannot there will be no war in the Middle East without Egypt, and there will be no peace without Syria. So the fact that the Syrians chose to stay away was also seen as problematic by some. But fundamentally, I think there was this perception on the American side that, well, we have to get going. We have to start this process and work on these issues. we have to do it now, even if some cannot be in the room. And then one said to us in an interview, you know, once we'll see what agreements we get to, then we can figure out who should be part of it. And then we can imagine beginning to negotiate something where perhaps at the beginning, not everyone will be part of the implementation, or it will not be implemented until everyone is part of it. But we have to sort of start this incremental process, even if the circumstances are not yet ripe for everyone to be at the table. So I think that was very much the thinking when it came to those who were absent in ACRS.
Thanks, Hanna. And in terms of the whole formation process, then, you know, how did this all impact in terms of atmospherics, in terms of the enthusiasm with which people came, the sense of the potential for achievement? How did this all begin in terms of the way it was then all set up?
So definitely there was a feeling among everyone that we interviewed that the Gulf War and then the Madrid practically conference that started the entire process afterwards was a turning point, both globally but mainly regionally. Among everyone that we interviewed, there was a lot of optimism. There was a lot of hope that really that opened a new era for the Middle East, that really you have almost carte blanche in which you can create a process that the idea is to transform relationship in the region. And you saw from everyone that we interviewed really a commitment for something like that. Was it possible or not? This was another question, but really, if you look on the atmosphere and the belief of what they're doing, there was a full commitment to make things better and to transform the Middle East and identify measures in which can reduce risk of accidental war, of buildup of weapons and things like that. So I must say, it was really heartwarming to hear all those people saying and the enthusiasm and the hope that they had in the early 1990s.
And, you know, having interviewed people, how much would you say that is looking back at the past through some rose-tinted glasses? How much at the time do you think that people were more, that tempered that hope and optimism with a little bit more cynicism than they might remember?
Let me be clear, they did not spare from us cynicism of later stages in the process. So I think they were honest about, or being able to distinguish between what they felt at the beginning of the process and the hope to what transpired and what obviously what happened today. So I do think that they are able to at least see the opportunity or feel what was an opportune moment at that time. But definitely, they do recognize that at the end of the day, the process failed, and they are very critical of why it failed, as well as what transpired during the process.
So in terms of the formation of the working groups and so on, and the participation, if you just step back a little bit from the interviews that you did, what's your assessment of the way in which they were thinking about what they would get out of it? And maybe I might be bleeding a little bit into what happened later, but at the beginning, do you think that they were coming at it with quite similar realistic expectations of where there might be places together, or were they actually on parallel tracks from the beginning?
So it leads to several aspects that were very unique to that process. And let me sort of get us a little bit back to the history. It's really, for many ways, and I would say for all the people that we interviewed that were part of the process, practically besides of the Egyptians, the main show in town was the bilaterals negotiations. And everyone really put their main emphasis about the bilaterals, and really the way that they saw the multilaterals as a supportive mechanism is to allow other Arab countries to be part of the process to support the bilaterals. If you look really on the US side of things, from Israel side of things, was that legitimize the process for the Palestinians to feel that they can be comfortable to actually speak directly with the Israelis. But also the hope was that by creating the multilaterals, there will be more willingness within the bilaterals to have some to make more efforts and to create the atmosphere for really a compromise. So when you look on ACRS, that was sort of, to many of those regional as well as international players, a sideshow. At the same time, they did a very specific objective within that process. And those objectives was really, some of it related to the bilaterals, but not all of them. So really for the US was really to create a long-term process and that can build very incrementally a personal relationship, and maybe that might be able to transform some threat perception. And the hope was that to transform relationship and to create this atmosphere that more countries will feel really comfortable to sit with each other. And we need to remember that was the first time countries in the region sat across the table from each other. It was the first time Israel was part of any regional negotiation. So that was really seems to be such a big leap of how we get in from this fact that most countries were very uncomfortable of doing it. And also we need to remember that especially the Arab countries that did not have peace agreement with Israel, and that time was everyone besides of Egypt. Jordan signed an agreement in 1994, which is towards almost the end of the process, but all other countries felt very uncomfortable to sit with Israel on something that is not related to the Palestinian issue. So all of them really put it as, we're willing to sit here, we're willing to support the process, but our eyes are on the bilaterals, and not only that our eyes on the bilaterals, we cannot let the multilaterals and ACRS to go farther than where we are in the bilaterals. So there was sort of a game, or there was sort of a balance sheet that is not clear really, there is no official balance sheet, but it was mainly on feelings of, as long as the bilateral tracks continuing, and it was mainly with the Palestinians, the other ones were less important to most of the other participate. As long as the bilateral tracks are going and going forward and going well, we will progress, and we allow progress on the multilaterals. Once there are issues with the bilaterals, we cannot let the multilaterals sort of go further. So that also complicated what are the objective of different countries, as well as how they see the entire process and what is the balance sheet that each one of them is holding. On the other end, the Egyptians were very different from the other Arab countries because they did not have a role, or a central role to play within the bilaterals. They were not part of it. Obviously, they had already peace agreement with Israel. So they were in a unique situation that they were trying to get out of isolation, complete isolation from Arab states because of their peace agreement with Israel. So joining the coalition during the Gulf War was the first step, and then really finding their role within the multilaterals and the peace process was the other step to really be integrated again in the Arab world, as well as to acquire or reacquire their leadership position. So really the question that they ask themselves is what our role here, how we can create it, and what we can find that can be a positive contribution to the process. So their position was almost completely different than most of the other countries, just in the way that they saw the strategic realities of their situation as opposed to the other ones.
Which of course explains a lot about today. And before I turn to Hanna, just one last question. During that whole process, we know that the Soviet Union was in a state of, had ended, Russia was in a state of sort of rebuilding and change and flux, and wasn't quite in the same situation as it was before. But what about the United States during that time, Chen, when ACRS was being formed? What was the United States' role in supporting it? Was it more interested in the bilaterals? Did it put the energy into the multilateral process? Did it give the support that was so important?
Yeah, so first, just to frame it within the process as a whole, really the US was the driver of the entire Madrid process, as well as the bilaterals, as well as the multilaterals. And within ACRS, because of the sensitivity of ACRS as a working group, and for Israel and Egypt, that was the most important one in the sense of sensitivity. The decision was that the US and, in that point, Soviet Union, later Russia, really early in the process it became Russia, will be the co-sponsor of the peace process as a whole, but also the co-chair or the co-gavel holders of ACRS. And that was because of the importance that both of them gave to that working group. And as such, what they did is really negotiate and facilitate everything, the rules of procedures, the agendas, they issued the co-chair summaries. They really took control of the entire process and led it. The US itself, at the end of the day, was the main driver because Russia and the Soviet Union and then Russia were really in the stages of the stages of collapse. They could not really take a bigger role given their domestic situation, but we were told again and again by regional countries that it was very important for them that both of them are showing unison in both objective as well as in participation. And we heard several times people saying the Russian participant practically participate on their own behalf almost, because there was no foreign ministry, there is no directions from Moscow, but they were dedicated and they saw it as important. But if you look on the differences in leadership as well as the role they played, there is no doubt the US was the main driver force behind it and really took, I would say, almost all possible roles within that process aside of really participate as a regional player. And partially it's because there was no, their role in the region and as the only superpower. And so everyone really followed whatever they said at that point of time. They didn't feel that they have much of option to say no, but also because there was no capacity in the region to create an agenda. And in that point of time, there was really no knowledge and expertise besides of really handful, and I would say almost only Egypt at that time, that really know those topics and knew how to even think about it in a conceptual or operational way.
Thanks, Hanna. I'm turning to Hanna now. The fault lines, the big problems, the challenges that were faced at the beginning. Could you see how they developed over time then during the actual negotiations in ACRS?
Yeah, thanks for that, Patricia. I mean, as far as we see it from all the interviews that we conducted, there were really two major fault lines that emerged as the process proceeded, which have to do with parties going into this process with divergent objectives from the start. And then what you have as a result of that is different narratives as to what actually brought down ACRS, what had the main causal weight in explaining the demise of ACRS. So let me unpack that a little bit. The first fault line is the relationship between the bilaterals. So Israel bilaterally negotiating with the Palestinians, Syria and Jordan. Chen pretty much outlined that fault line already, saying that most parties just thought that the bilaterals were the main show. And that fault line continued as sort of ACRS got to work. But then there was another important fault line, and that was the relationship between discussing arms control and ultimately the nuclear issue, Israel's nuclear capacity and regional security. And that fault line became reflected in a split between a conceptual basket and an operational basket at some point as ACRS proceeded. Perhaps Chen can talk a little bit more about how that split came about. But for the time, let me just say that over time, the Israeli view was that this basket split was a good thing because it allowed for a natural progression of these talks, confidence building measures on certain military and technical aspects to be reached in this operational basket without everything being held hostage to sort of progress on discussing the nuclear issue and sort of, where we get to at the end of the road, potentially a WMD-free zone, which was left to the conceptual basket to deal with. So the Israelis were happy to proceed with that basket split. I think the Egyptian view was very much, we're okay proceeding this way as long as we have a serious discussion on arms control, but we will not let the other working groups of the multilateral track. Let's not forget that ACRS wasn't the only one, there were others. We will not let these other working groups or these confidence building measures in the operational basket progress beyond the conceptual basket. And I think therefore this maxim that nothing is agreed in ACRS until everything is agreed was also incredibly important to the Egyptians. Now, on that fault line, there was then over time an Israeli perception, as indicated in our interviews, that Egypt found itself increasingly isolated among the other Arabs over time, with this stance of holding progress on other issues hostage to the arms control agenda, whereas I think Egypt felt mostly supported by and followed by the other Arabs, who were also happy for Egypt to take the lead in this process. But certainly you can say that when progress in the operational baskets became too pronounced over time from an Egyptian point of view, and this is now I'm using the words of an American senior diplomat, Egypt tried to take back control over the process, which really meant that they were trying to make sure that these things in the operational basket don't get concluded. And so the key thing to stress here is, I think, that delegations that we interviewed, and sometimes even individuals within delegations, then differ in terms of which of these two fault lines, sort of carries the main causal weight in explaining the demise of ACRS. And there are a few views, and if you allow me, I'll just briefly break them down. There's basically one view that also gives a lot of causal weight to Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin's assassination in November 1995 towards the end of ACRS, and the subsequent election of Bibi Netanyahu. And that view basically says the multilaterals fell apart because the bilaterals got stuck, and the bilaterals also got stuck because Netanyahu was elected. So basically the peace process ground to a halt, and that affected the overall mood within which the multilaterals were operating, and ACRS became a victim of that. There's a variation of this view, which puts the sort of the problem with the bilaterals not so much towards the end of the process when Netanyahu got elected, but which basically says this predominance of the bilaterals implicit was really a problem from the beginning, because as one Israeli put it put shackles on ACRS from the start. There was never a desire to let this ACRS process move beyond the bilaterals. And so that was what had to paralyze it over time. But then there's a second view, which basically says ACRS was well in trouble before the bilaterals became into trouble, before Netanyahu was elected. Already by the plenary in Tunis in December 1994, the Egyptians basically had concluded that Israel was never going to be serious about discussing sort of the nuclear issue within ACRS. Various sort of Arab interlocutors put that point of reckoning at different points over time, but basically they say, look, ACRS would have failed no matter what over this arms control versus regional security fault line, and regardless of where the bilaterals had gone. And I think that's how you get these sort of various views, I would say, even within delegations, and really no consensus on how these fault lines played out over time.
And there were other instances as well, and you might want to go through what you're calling, the inflection points. And I wonder as well, would you say that there's never just one thing that stops? It's a culmination, and then there may be a straw that breaks the camel's back, or maybe not. I mean, it could be that had it not been for a number of these things, then there might have been enough resilience or elasticity in the system that they could have got over it, but because there were all these other things, that it was too brittle. Would you agree with that analysis?
Well, that's a brilliant and difficult question, and we can get to that perhaps more towards the end. And I'm curious also to hear Chen's view. I mean, I will just say that there is a certain view that emerged from the interviews, which says that this fundamental discrepancy in approach, that at the end of the day, the Egyptians would argue, we need to talk arms control seriously, including the nuclear issue, and that will lead us to peace. And the Israeli fundamental position was, we need to have peace in the region before we can talk about arms control, that was never going to be bridged. No matter how you designed the process, with no degree of incrementalism, would be able to overcome that dichotomy in the absence really of political will. But certainly there were inflection points. I mean, there was, I think, a perception really among the Egyptians when we came up to the April-May 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference, that, you know, they were getting really frustrated with a lack of progress in the conceptual basket on the arms control bit in acres. And as one Egyptian diplomat said to us in an interview, you know, in the context of this REFCON, we were asked to take a blind leap of faith, agreeing to an indefinite extension of the NPT without really any sense of Israel giving us anything on arms control, whether in acres or elsewhere. So that's certainly hardened position. So I think the 1995 conference is an important inflection point. There were some inflection points. I mean, I might not call them inflection points, but perhaps important moments through the ACRS years, which perhaps had a more positive impact, like the conclusion of the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, with which Chen already mentioned, like the Oslo Accords, which sort of gave a more sort of positive push, maybe, generated some positive atmospherics, but then certainly in terms of negative inflection points, what stood out from the interviews that we conducted is really the 1995 REFCON and then the assassination of Rabin later that year.
If I might add, so
yeah.
This is really a question, I would say, almost of counterfactuals, right? It's like, if the peace process would have succeeded, and if other things that happen at the same time would have not happened, will ACRS could have continued and be more successful. And I think in some degrees I agree with Hanna that the peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, if would have continued, and actually Oslo did happen during that time. So there was a big sort of achievement that was considered by everyone that we interview an achievement and important impetus for a positive process, a positive atmosphere in the ACRS process. But if that would have continued successfully, then there could be a breach between Israel and Egypt. And I don't think that was it. I don't think it could have happened, because the Israeli position at the time was very clear. It's not only about the peace process, and it's not only Israel-Palestine, the Palestinian one, it's Israel, the Palestinian, and then the 3 other bilaterals, and it's also a comprehensive peace among all regional states. So the bilateral Israel-Palestinian track will not have been a sufficient one. It would have been an important one. Maybe it would have allowed Israel to take a little bit more, be more forthcoming with some of the commitment that they would have agreed to do. But I don't think it would have been sufficient to the Egyptian at that point of time.
And one. So I've got lots and lots of questions, but one big question is about personalities, right? And the role of individuals. So we have processes, we have structures, we have issues. I mean, it's all doomed to failure. Is there anything that could save this? And the answer is sometimes, yes, sometimes these work out, and sometimes that's due to certain personalities. So what was the role of personalities in all of this? Hanna, Chen, either of you, whichever wishes to.
Yeah, I'm happy to say a few words, Chen, and then you can compliment me. But I think, I mean, we talked a lot about personalities, about personal relationships, about dynamics between different delegations in these oral history interviews. And there was pretty much a sense across the board, even by those most skeptical of, you know, achievements in ACRS and whether sort of substantively the process yielded anything, that relationship building, trust building, some used the sort of the language, the humanizing of the other side, the fact that you could have a civilian conversation about these difficult topics in that region, that was sort of really important. Perhaps I would say that the Americans in their assessments of, you know, sort of observing these personal relations form were most enthusiastic about sort of characterizing them in the interviews. And perhaps some of the regionals were a bit more subdued in their characterizations. That's something that we noticed in the interviews. There were certain individuals, personalities that were mentioned frequently across the interviews, and I will just mention some of them here. I mean, certainly James Baker on the American side was sort of considered instrumental for getting this process off the ground in the first place, but then also other participants in the American delegation, like Bob Einhorn, of course, Nabil Fahmy, the head of the Egyptian delegation, and Ali Erfan for Egypt, David Ivry for the Israeli delegation, leading the Israeli delegation, also Dr. Eli Levite, Abdullah Tokan on the Jordanian side. And then, there are others who were mentioned. And there was a sense that these are all very, very serious individuals who come with the expertise, who come with the energy to really, get this process underway. I mean, in reflecting sort of on lessons from ACRS, some said, this process really showed the importance of bringing the A-team. Everyone brought their A-team to ACRS, and that really mattered. Of course, there were the assessments of personal dynamics were not uniformly positive. Individuals mentioned difficult episodes, difficult encounters during this process, or sort of characterizing the other side as sometimes stubborn or sometimes arrogant in the proceedings. So it was a really mixed picture. I think there was an appreciation for the fact that in other delegations, one encountered not just diplomats, but also military and technical personnel. Of course, the civil-military balance within these delegations was also not uniform. So I think that was an interesting experience for many. And then finally, I just want to sort of say this because I see it as one of the main, main achievements of this oral history project as a whole is that we have collected so many anecdotes and stories that transpired in ACRS. We have many anecdotes of social occasions which really mattered for participants to sort of form a bond. And I might just give you one sort of quick example, which I thought was a really lovely story, which is from a dinner at a workshop on maritime confidence building measures in Nova Scotia in September 1993, at which the delegates ended up singing sailor songs together. So, a Canadian naval officer who told us the story started singing Chevalier de la Table Ronde, and then he said the Americans were too shy to sing, so the Russian officer started singing first. Then others came in, and when they called on the Arabs to sort of participate, it was the Bahraini who volunteered to sing a song. And at the very end, the Israelis also sang a Jewish folk song. And, that sort of to make the point that was really important for the atmospherics. And we have, many, many stories like those.
Oh, that's a great story. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to kind of push on a little bit faster and bring both of you in to talk about the lessons learned, both from achievements and failures, Hanna, and I think then Chen, if you look at what lessons we have today. So I'll start with Hanna and then move on to Chen to look at those two aspects of the lessons that we might draw. And I just wanted to bring in the observation, which you might want to answer, is would we be talking and analysing ACRS in the way we are today if it had been successful?
Thanks, Patricia. Maybe I'll sort of quickly run through the achievements as they were identified in our interviews, and then maybe Chen, you want to sort of go over a bit more into lessons learned. But just to run quickly through the main themes of achievements that have emerged. The first really to say is that ACRS was a precedent and almost served as a proof of concept. That's where the sort of the main achievement lies. It's a front runner, a reference point. It showed that you can actually have this kind of process in this region. One delegate said, it's like a string of a guitar that will continue to resonate if you pluck it. So it's still, the legacy of it is still with us. And especially if we take a long view of what constitutes progress on regional security and arms control in a region like the Middle East, the foundation 30 years ago in ACRS very much mattered. Second achievement, the cultivation of personal relationships and building of mutual trust. I already just mentioned that, so I won't go into that. Third, ACRS afforded a multidimensional learning opportunity to the different sides. learning about your adversary, about the other side and what's possible, what's not possible. Learning, of course, from historical precedent, from confidence building measures in other regions of the world, in other geographic locations, learning about the military perspectives. And importantly, this learning also had wider ripple effects because ACRS delegates took what they learned back into their capitals, and ACRS also contributed to the formation of wider expertise on arms control, formation of certain bureaucracies in some of these countries. Fourth, a very tangible result, the actual confidence building measures that were agreed in the operational basket. We haven't talked about those so much, but from procedures for pre-notification of military activities to certain maritime confidence building measures, agreements on search and rescue, and so on. I mean, none of these were formally adopted as a matter of sort of a political agreement, but they were reached, and there was even encouragement at the time that those might be implemented on a voluntary basis. A fifth achievement was that there was some positive spillover from ACRS onto other conflict and issue areas. There was very much a feeling that it helped sort of Israeli-Jordanian relations and sort of the path towards the treaty, but also Israeli-Turkish relations, for instance. And final achievement that it regionalized the conversation about arms control and security, which prior to ACRS was usually had much more in a bilateral fashion. And so this time you managed to bring Israel into a multilateral regional discussion, and also amplified the sense that regional security in the Middle East is really about much more than the Arab-Israeli conflict. Perhaps I'll end there and let Chen say a few words.
Sure. So with regard to some of the lesson learned, I would say first regard to the design, the process design, as well as the participation. So obviously inclusivity is very important. And at the end of the day, while maybe in the 1990s that was a bridge too far, today, I don't really see a viable process where you don't have Iran, where you don't have Syria, where you don't have Israel or Egypt for that matter. And really the assumption right now, as we know, is that at least with the process that's going on right now, and let me sort of go into the 2020, almost 2 years rather than 1990s, if the assumption right now is that we are starting a process and other will join, I'm not sure, and I think it's a very risky assumption that might left us sometimes really with nothing rather than with something if we were trying to have something more inclusive. With regard to consensus, and we didn't really speak about that, one of the format of ACRS was that everything is going to be decided by consensus, and that was very important in order to make sure that Israel feel comfortable, because there were 1 as opposed to 13 Arab countries and in automatic practically minority in every vote. And what we see today, interestingly enough, with the process that as it is today, that has become a huge issue for Iran, because Iran found himself in the same situation. So I think consensus is really something that almost the only way that can work in the region, given the really minority or being in a minority situation of some countries and almost automatic minority. Also with regards to comprehensive approach, and this is something that I think, as demonstrated, ACRS did not happen in a vacuum. It happened within a bigger process, and so, which was helpful in some ways, and it was unhelpful in other ways. But the question is, can a regional process on arms control can take place by itself as a standalone process? And I can tell you that most of our interviewees did not think it's possible. And it will be interesting to see that, given the fact that right now, we don't have a comprehensive regional peace process or any regional security process. We have several pockets of different countries are trying to do something, but there is no regional process. Can you have a separate standalone arms control or disarmament or non-proliferation processes without any regional security dialogue? And according to most of the people that we interviewed, that cannot really be, or cannot succeed if you want a sustainable one without resolving the security issues in the region. So then that sort of related both to the design as well as participation. And then there is issue really of incrementalism. And when we look on, or when we spoke with the Egyptian and Israelis, it was really interesting because not only both of them blamed the other side, but also each one of them said, if the other side gave us just a little bit more, a little hope, we would have continued. So there is both sides feel that there is some missed opportunities that, for example, the Egyptian view was that if Israel, they really missed an opportunity, and if they would have gone a little bit farther in the language of the DOP and really give Egypt a little bit more signal that they will be willing to consider the NPT in one point of time. They didn't even say when necessarily they wanted to they didn't require or insisted on timeline. If they would have gone that, we would have gone much more. It will create the atmosphere to go further. On the other one, the Israeli side really think that the Egyptian missed an opportunity, since Israel did indicated early the readiness to consider under specific circumstances when a weapon of mass destruction free zone or the NPT would be possible. So they feel really that if Egypt will allow the process to continue, they would have got a better commitment or more strong commitment later on. So I think this feeling of missed opportunities, but there is not really self-reflection of missed opportunities. It's missed opportunity on the other side, really show that I would say there is not a lot of progress in maturity of really taking one end responsibility on the process, but also of what are your mistakes and what is your important parts that you could have done differently, maybe. And the answer might be that they're none, but we didn't really see that reflection at all within those interviews.
That's perhaps the most significant finding, isn't it? In that, you know, we don't really learn from our own mistakes. We point the fingers at others and blame still. So my last question before handing back to Christian and whether others wanting to take the floor and ask questions, but is there anything or a few things that you can think of that would have made the difference, that could have been done, that would have changed the trajectory and could have ended up with at least some kind of pathway forward from ACRS?
So I think, and I tried a little bit to start this answer with regard to the counterfactual. I think if there was for sure a solid bilateral Israeli-Palestinian agreement that is sort of a final agreement, not something that was supposed to interim and that. So if the Palestinian-Israeli issue would have gone much farther to an agreement, to peace agreement practically, and then the same thing would have happened on a regional level. So practically, if you did see a security regional process, I think Israel might have felt a little bit more comfortable to take small steps. And here, let me be clear, that we don't speak about disarmament, we don't speak about timelines, we speak about small steps that Israel might would have agreed to take to address some of the Egyptian need and objective of where we are going and when it's going to happen. But I do think the sort of the preview, the way that Israel at least looked at that, and to some degree the Americans as well, it was a long process, step-by-step process of 40, 50 plus years. It was not the timeline that Egyptians were looking at. And those sort of missynchronization in the clocks, I don't know if it could have been addressed unless really there was a big and serious regional security process that take place and saw some progress.
I mean, very quickly, one open question is what difference it had made if perhaps there would have been a very, very strong push by the Americans to continue regardless. I mean, this again gets into different narratives of what transpired at the end. An Israeli feeling that the Americans sort of didn't push the Egyptians enough, not quote unquote to derail the multilaterals and ACRS within that. And at the same time, an Egyptian feeling that the Americans could have put more pressure on the Israelis, as one Egyptian put it to me, not to, not have the nuclear issue on the table. It was sort of on the side of the table, at the edge of the table, maybe on a chair but not quite on the table, and that the Americans didn't put enough pressure on the Israelis to really put it on the table. There was a general feeling in some of our interviews that the Americans progressively lost interest in ACRS as things were not going so well with the bilaterals over time. So I guess one question is, could a much more active, a much more forceful US delegation have made a difference to at least keep the process alive for a longer time? But I fundamentally agree with Chen that these fundamental divergences would not have been overcome.
Yes. So, well, I mean, I think we all learned a huge amount from all of this analysis, and I think you're going to produce the most extraordinary report with all of these interviews and so on. So I want to thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I'm going to hand back to Christian now, because I know that there are people wanting to take the floor and ask questions.
Right. Thank you, Patricia, for very skillfully and artfully kind of fostering this really wonderful conversation that, even having sat through and moderated the critical oral history sessions last month, I learned a lot from Hanna's and Chen's responses. And I do have questions too, but I do want to bring in some audience members. Again, we have a quite formidable audience. There are two ways you can participate. One is to use the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality. It will cue you in line and will call on you to mute yourself, and then you can pose your question. Or you can use the Q&A function and write your question, and we'll convey those to the panelists. And Patricia, there may be a chance later on in the discussion also to ask additional questions. But while I give folks a chance to get ready for their questions, just wearing the historian's hat for a moment, Hanna and Chen. And let me point out that most of the transcripts and documents that have fed into this process will be published and made accessible, and also the transcript of the conversation through the Wilson Center's digital archive. So at some point, all of you will be able to go directly to some of the sources that we've been talking about. But Hanna and Chen, what are, in terms of the process, the gaps in terms of our historical understanding of the process? What were kind of the big black holes that or white spots that you weren't able to fill in through the interviews and the documentation that we've gathered? I'm thinking there may be some ambitious grad students out there listening to this conversation now or in the future who might want to delve into some of those unresolved, undocumented issues.
So I think some of those are really question related how we got to where we got. So what were the decision process or decision-making process that led to different decision that led into ACRS? So for example, who suggested ACRS would be included as part of the 5 working groups? So the question like that, or who decided what the format is? Questions like how different the objectives were. I think we got much more nuance through the conversation and the interviews that I at least did not appreciate as much before. And then questions regard to lesson learned that it's less the oral history part of it, but when we really ask people to put themselves in the 1990s and think about what they could have or should have done differently, as well as what it's relevant for today. That was really interesting to see people that were trying to design something in the 1990s under conditions in the region then, an international situation, and then today, and their reflection about what changed. And there is also disagreement among those that we interviewed. Is the situation better or worse today than it was in the 1990s? That was really interesting to sort of understand what they thought is better and what they thought is actually worse.
Thank you, Hanna. Any gaps?
So just to quickly build on Chen, I mean, if I compare all the data that we have sort of collected as part of this oral history with sort of policy analysis or other accounts that were written of acres. I think where our project is adding is really in bringing out some of the nuance in different states' perspectives, to the extent that you realize, okay, perhaps even within the Israeli delegation or within the American delegation, there was not a completely uniform view on some of these fault lines, some of these issues, but people have different perspectives. Even to tease out some of the intra-delegation dynamics, learn a bit more how a delegation to ACRS was actually put together back in the capital, how consultations went after each ACRS plenary back in the capital. I think that is sort of an element that I didn't see in other studies. And then just briefly, I mentioned it already, I think the wealth of anecdotes and stories is of course also largely absent from sort of, policy analysis on ACRS. And I think they bring the process to life to a certain extent. And so I found it really valuable to collect those as well.
Thank you. Let's go to Avner Cohen, who's raised his hand and would like to join the conversation. Avner, we'll call on you. There you are. Please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Good. I have a very different perspective on that. It is a perspective not exactly of participant, because I was not a participant, but I was active person involved in those years. Marvin Miller and I ran a project on arms control in the Middle East, in which we tried to incorporate, conceptually at least, how to address the nuclear issue. And first, I would say a few words about the way that Chen framed the issue. Much of it is missing the big elephant in the room, which was an effort how to address the Israeli nuclear issue. There is no question. Jim Baker may have been naive, and maybe even people under him as Einhorn, but there was an American sincere effort to think, after the UN Resolution 678 that was dismantling of Iraq, there is another nuclear power undeclared in the region, and time has come to try to see what we can do with it. There are certain understandings that were made long time ago that people were not even fully aware of their full operational level between Nixon and Golda Meir, but Americans felt that maybe it is time to start to explore what can we discuss, what we can do with the nuclear issue, given the new situation, given the new architecture. And there was various elements which I think that Chen and Hanna would never get in terms, because they're still classified, and it will be probably for some time, about the preparation on the US side and of course the Israeli side. And the American issue was, and Chen did not mention the proposal of the same administration, the Bush administration, for cutoff, which was a main issue, which Israel gave essentially, after some time of hesitation, a very strong no. So on the American side was, time has come, given what we've done in the Gulf, to try to incorporate and to try to find a way. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the Israeli nuclear issue, something that has been so far a taboo, and it was recognized taboo. And it was within that context that the US thought that maybe we'll give all elements of recognitions and what you call the operational basket, which part of it is lip service, part of it is technical issue, which are not very significant, to allow various elements of beginning of conversation. And I think the lesson was, and I think the process was doomed and was not mature from the very beginning, but it proved, and I saw it from the side, because we at MIT, we organized 2 meetings actually with Israeli, discrete, quiet meeting, including Shalhevet Fryer and others from the top Israeli establishments, member of Knesset and others. And we realized that Israel was not ready at all to discuss and to address the nuclear issue. And as long as this was the case and they were ready to do other things, but not to discuss, it actually proved the robustness and the power of opacity. And if you know something, I knew it informally about the Israeli inside decision process, the security people, a particular man called Yechiel Chorev, he took a very strong hold on the process. He makes a lot of blogs. It's not that Israel refused to all of what he said, but essentially there was a lot of vetoes. So it was from the very beginning an effort, an American effort, a little bit naive, a little bit immature, to see what can we do about this. And it ended with nothing at this point. It's not ready. So I think it was done very, very early on. There was an effort to give it some kind of resuscitation, give it some kind of oxygen to on and on and on. And the other final thing that Chen did not mention, which was, I think, the final blow, was towards the 1995 making the NPT permanent. It was in that case that Egypt wanted to have a position of its own and wanted to have some kind of benefits. And it was clear that Israel refused to do anything. I can say personally that I saw that, as I said, on the side, because I saw the hostility that there was in Israel towards our project. That was also an effort, informal and academic effort, to look into that. So that element is quite important. And I thought Hanna somewhat mentioned that, and I thought it seems that in the accounts of the official participant, it may have been a little bit nostalgic and a little bit Pollyannish, but the issue is still sensitive today, and I think it should be acknowledged.
Thank you. Thanks, Chen. Yeah.
So I must say that from the 25 interviews that we did for the Americans, none of them agree with Avner. So either they don't recall what were their motivations, or they had a little bit different motivations. Now, I don't say that they didn't think about it, but I say that ACRS for them was not about Israel disarmament. It was trying to find ways to reduce all the aspects related to armament in the region. And for them, the objective, the end objective, the way to do it was weapon of mass destruction free zone in the region. And obviously part of it, in order to achieve it, was requiring Israel to disarm one way or the other. But for sure, none of them said to us, and none of them acknowledge, unless they, Avners think that they were not truthful, that the objective was Israeli disarmament. Now, that's not to say that Egypt did not join the process because of that, because this is completely true. Egypt's objective is this entire ACRS process was to get to Israeli disarmament. And that was something that they said repeatedly, and something that they acknowledge, and that's something that they say, we joined reluctantly the process, not because we didn't think the Israelis are very serious about it, but also because we are concerned that the Israelis and the other Arabs are moving forward in other aspects that we really don't care about. So we had to sort of try to control the process until we get what we came in for. Otherwise, there's nothing in this party for us. So this is with regard to sort of where the Israeli nuclear disarmament fit, or from what we heard from all the interviewees. With regard to the preparation, and we didn't get into these issues, but there is a lot of, and you will see in the report, with regard to how each of the country prepare for ACRS, and definitely you will see, and this is something that the Israelis were very upfront as well as forthcoming about how they prepare, and with many layers of committees, with thinking about the strategic studies about it, what they will feel comfortable and how far they can go. But also there was recognition in Israel that they really did not know arms control. They don't really understand non-proliferation, and they need to study that at that time, because Israel really did not participate until then in any arms control treaties. They just started in the 90s at the same time. So this is something that happened at the same time as they were learning about this concept, as well as how much they are willing to go with regard to their policy, either opacity as well as capabilities. And then with regard, Avner, what you said about the NPT, this is something that we are still exploring actually, because what is interesting to us is that about half a year before the NPT review conference, when it was very clear to the Americans that they want consensus, and for the Egyptian that they have power because the Americans want consensus, and because the Egyptians start jeopardizing some aspect within ACRS because they didn't really think it's going for anywhere. There was several meetings between Amr Moussa and Peres, negotiating or trying to figure out what Israel, and Israel really, and I think that came from pressure from the US because of the upcoming NPT review conference and their wish to get a consensus about the extension, was what Israel is willing to give the Egyptian a little bit to make sure that the Egyptian will join the consensus on the NPT review conference. And what you saw is different statements, and we are still trying to figure out what exactly were said behind closed door as opposed to what was said in the media. But at that time, Paris in the media committed for Israel to join to the NPT 2 years after, sorry, the establishment of a weapon of mass destruction free zone 2 years after comprehensive peace agreement in the region. And that was the idea, was really give something, or to try to give something to appease the Egyptians, so they will, on the other end, will not jeopardize ACRS, and on the other end will join the consensus in the NPT review conference. And Hanna mentioned some of those aspects already. So there were a lot of give and take at that time. Was insufficient in the Egyptian point of view at that time as well. So that's important to say, but it's not. But it's also important to acknowledge that there were discussions. You might think that they were not serious. The Egyptian thought that they were not serious at the time, but there were discussion about that. So this is just to make sure that it is on the table as something that took place. I don't know if Hanna, you have anything else to add?
Yeah, do you want to chime in?
I mean, I don't have much to add. Chen's response was fairly comprehensive, but just very briefly, perhaps on this notion that was evoked by Professor Cohen, that perhaps the Americans went into this with a naivete regarding what could be achieved regarding Israeli nuclear disarmament at the time. My sense from the interviews with the Americans was that they were very, very aware at that time, entering the process, how much of a heavy lifting it would be to ever get to that point. But it was this incrementalist notion that, you know, if you can get progress, serious progress on Israeli-Arab peace on the various bilateral tracks incrementally, this would heighten perhaps Israel's willingness to give a bit more on the nuclear issue. Again, as Chen said, not at all disarmament, but be more forthcoming vis-a-vis the Egyptians in these talks, and that this could sort of play out over time, sort of over a long period of time. I think this is very much the mindset with which they approached this process.
Thank you. We have a question from Gabrielle Pignon. Did they try later on to include Syria? Was it the main goal of the process to be able to integrate them?
So the problem at the time was really that the Syrian did not want to be integrated, but also that until at least 1993, almost the end, or 1994, when the Syrian-Israeli tracks were going on, that was where Syria, the entire energy was on that track. And at times, actually, it seems more positive at times than the Palestinian track. So really, the Syrians were really not interested to be integrated at that point of time. And I don't think they actually had also the capacity to do it. But they were not interested to be integrated, but they were always invited. So they were not excluded from the process.
Just to briefly add to that, sort of one interesting anecdote that one of the senior US diplomats shared, there was even at some point a Syrian sense that what was going on in ACRS might sort of derail the Syrian efforts with the Israelis and the bilateral track. So there was apparently a Syrian diplomat coming to this senior American diplomat in '95, sort of complaining about the Egyptian insistence on talking about the nuclear issue within ACRS, thereby, quote unquote, sort of putting the Israelis in a corner and perhaps making them more reluctant to be forthcoming in what were then sort of Israeli-Syrian talks at the time. So that actually sort of is an insinuation to also some of the intra-Arab differences that we see playing out at that time. I mean, this was sort of one select anecdote, so I don't want to claim that that's sort of necessarily representative for a broader view, but this did come up.
Thank you. Talking about, we've talked a lot about Egypt and Israel and the US. I wonder if you could just talk for a moment, and I see Eliza has a question as well. If you could talk for a moment about some of the other participants and their role in the process. We've naturally focused on, the main players, but what was the role of some of the other participants?
Let me just go briefly on some of them, and Hanna can pick up the ones I did not cover. So first with the Palestinians, I think the interesting things with the Palestinians was really not exactly as Hanna mentioned with the Syrians, but they were concerned that ACRS and the multilaterals are derailing or undermining the bilaterals with them, because practically their perception was, you give Israel normalization and we didn't solve the problem with us yet, so you give them the dividends of peace without getting into peace yet, and without us getting what we wanted, which is statehood, recognition, etc. So for the Palestinians, although they did participate in ACRS, not very active participant, but they did participate in ACRS, but at the beginning as part of the Jordanian delegation, after that as independent delegation. Really, they were concerned that it's really detracting from their track. With regard to Jordan, that's really interesting, because Jordan played, I would say, a moderating role, especially between Israel and the Egyptians. They were a lot of the time the go-between them, and trying really to find compromises as well as ideas of how we can move the process forward, while at the same time much more giving the bilateral between them and Israel, and the peace agreement was the result, but also between them and between the Palestinians and Israel, the primacy and the importance. So but specifically, and Hanna mentioned Abdullah Tukhan, Dr. Abdullah Tukhan, he was a force to reckon with. He was really, is a nuclear physicist, is somebody that that's his expertise. It's like he knows the technical aspects, he knew the military as well. So he brought into the table a lot of ideas and proactiveness that was much bigger than Jordan's sort of role in the entire region, I would say. We mentioned a little bit Turkey, and that was interesting. Turkey was not a regional state. They were considered extra-regional state, and they were considered one of the mentors that was brought into play and to help with some of the confidence-building measures. And they hosted at least 2 conferences in Antalya that actually everyone thought that they were very helpful and very useful regard to pre-notification of military actions. I'm trying to think anyone else, Hanna, that is important to.
I mean, maybe just beyond Turkey, I think what was also sort of a uniform assessment across interviews was that the role of third parties, of mentors, of countries sort of shepherding the work in the operational baskets and some of these specific working groups, Turkey, Canada, the Netherlands, India was involved. Chen, correct me if I'm forgetting some here, but that was uniformly assessed as very positive and is extremely helpful to the process. That expertise that came in from third parties was very much valued. Maybe just one final quick thing to say here on sort of other parties and ACRS. I think for some of the smaller delegations from the Gulf and from the Maghreb, ACRS also afforded an opportunity to raise their profiles a little bit in the region. So the Qataris, for instance, Doha, hosted the 5th plenary in ACRS. And sort of again, anecdotally, sort of some indicated that the Qataris were really keen at that plenary for progress to be made on the Declaration of Principles, the DOP, and sort of to get to a serious text in order to sort of send a signal to the Saudis, sort of a matter of status and prestige. That is also something that came out in the interviews.
Thank you very much. Liz, do you have a final brief question? Yeah, okay, very brief question and brief answers because we're just about out of time.
I feel like I'm gonna just blow up a powder keg, but what about nuclear weapons in Turkey? I mean, how is it possible to talk about denuclearizing, making the Middle East a nuclear weapon free zone and not bring up the issue of American weapons in the Middle East?
So that's why Turkey is excluded from the Middle East, according to the zone. That's exactly the answer. So really, the fault line or the geographical delineation of the Middle East was drawn based on practically, and at that time, excluding Turkey because Turkey is part of NATO and there are nuclear weapons in Turkey, or US nuclear weapons in Turkey, and that's why they were excluded from the region. But it's also interesting to see the Turkey's differences, and you can see, you know, from the 90s until today, the outlook, Turkey's outlook has changed, and sometimes it's European, sometimes it's Middle Eastern, and sometimes it's Asian, and it really depends of what you're looking at. But if we sort of do it forward to today and sort of realities today and any process that is going on today, Turkey is still excluded. And interestingly, I have two interesting questions that I sometimes ask my Middle Eastern colleagues that thinking about or negotiating this is two things. One is, if obviously many of the security issues that you are dealing with in the region, Turkey is part of them, if you want it or not. How are you thinking about including Turkey within the zone, as not as a member, because they're not going to be a member, but which other ways that you can include them? And one way that they're thinking is through the protocols, once there is a zone negotiated. The other question that I have for them, what will happen, and this is, I see many Turkish friends and colleagues on the call, what will happen if there is a decision either by Turkey or the US to withdraw the nuclear weapons from Turkey? Will then the delineation of the region of the zone will change or not? And this is something that it's beyond anyone's ability or ability to answer me a serious answer about it. But it's a good and important question to ask, because many of those countries are considered Turkey as part of the region for their threat perception, as well as for any solutions that is going on in most of the conflicts in the region today.
Thank you. It is 12:30, Hanna. Unless you really want to chime in on this, I'd like to bring this, I have to bring this fascinating and really, really rich conversation to an end. Let me thank Patricia for fostering and starting up this really wonderful discussion. Of course, to Hanna and Chen for the partnership, being on this panel today. We look forward to the report, and of course also to sharing with everyone all the documents and transcripts down the road through our digital archive. Let me turn it over to our partner at Bilkent, Eliza George, for some final words. Thank you, Eliza.
Thank you so much, Christian, and thank you, Dr. Kane, Dr. Notte, Professor Lewis, for a very interesting conversation, very interesting presentation, which brings a very fruitful year to an end. We started this partnership in 2020, and we've had a lot of presentations that really gave us path-breaking research, and yours is one of those. So thank you on behalf of my colleagues, Onur Işçi, Sam Hurst here at Bilkent. We look forward to our seminars next year. We're sure they're going to be just as interesting, and we hope you will join us. Those of you in the audience today will join us for those seminars as well. Looking forward to the report, to seeing it in print, and we wish everyone a nice evening, a good holiday season, and see you safely and healthily in 2022.
Thank you.
Thanks
to the Wilson Center team for the AV services here, and Kian, to you as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.